The maintenance worker's crowbar hit something hollow behind the plaster wall of Willowbrook Asylum. March 1978, and the building was scheduled for demolition by week's end. What emerged from that hidden compartment were 7 leather-bound journals describing treatments that families had praised while their daughters endured something entirely different. Thomas Garrett had been stripping the third-floor treatment rooms when his tool punched through into a space that shouldn't exist. Behind the false wall, wrapped in oilcloth and remarkably preserved, sat medical journals belonging to Dr. Jones Brownfield. The dates spanned 1891 through 1903. Garrett opened the first volume, expecting routine medical notations. The handwriting was meticulous, the entries detailed beyond anything he'd seen in hospital records. What made Garrett's hands shake wasn't medical jargon. It was the clinical precision with which Brownfield described what he called intimate therapeutic interventions for female hysteria. Page after page documented private treatment sessions with young women, procedures he claimed restored mental equilibrium through physical intimacy. The doctor's theory, laid out in the journal's introduction, argued that hysteria stemmed from feminine repression, requiring direct manual stimulation and complete intimate contact as medical necessity. Brownfield wrote with absolute conviction. He cited European physicians, referenced ancient medical texts, constructed elaborate justifications for why traditional treatments failed, where his succeeded. Each patient received individualized care in locked treatment rooms, sessions lasting hours. The doctor's methods applied with what he described as therapeutic precision. He documented physical responses, emotional reactions, the progression of treatment across weeks and months. By the time the Clearfield County Historical Society arrived 3 hours later, Garrett had discovered something even more disturbing. Tucked between journal pages were letters from grateful parents. The Kimball family thanking Brownfield for their daughter's remarkable recovery. The Rutherfords praising his dedication and innovative approach. The Danvers family crediting him with saving their youngest from permanent institutionalization. Letter after letter expressed profound gratitude for treatments they clearly didn't understand. Dr. Patricia Hollis, the Historical Society's director, immediately recognized what she was reading. Brownfield had convinced 8 families that intimate contact was legitimate medical therapy. The parents believed their daughters were receiving cutting-edge psychiatric care. They donated money for facility improvements, recommended Brownfield to other families, wrote testimonials for medical journals. Meanwhile, their daughters endured what the journals described in language that made Hollis physically ill. The asylum had operated under Brownfield's absolute authority. As the sole physician and medical director, he controlled all patient access, determined treatment protocols, decided when families could visit. His credentials were impeccable. Yale-educated, published researcher, member of the county medical board. Local newspapers from the 1890s praised his compassionate care and revolutionary results. What made Hollis contact the state attorney general wasn't just the journals. It was the cross-reference she made with county records that afternoon. 12 birth certificates filed between 1891 and 1903. 12 young women from 8 families, all patients at Willowbrook, during their pregnancies. All treated exclusively by Dr. Jones Brownfield, using methods their parents had celebrated as medical breakthrough. The journals explained these pregnancies as evidence of successful treatment. Restored feminine function, proof that his intimate therapy worked precisely as intended. Brownfield even documented the grateful responses from families when their daughters showed signs of pregnancy. Families who believed this meant their daughters were cured, capable of normal life again. Pennsylvania authorities opened a historical investigation within 48 hours. Even after 80 years, what happened at Willowbrook demanded acknowledgement. The Clearfield County Gazette announced Dr. Jones Brownfield's arrival in September of 1890 with front-page enthusiasm. The article described a Yale-trained physician bringing revolutionary treatment for female nervous disorders to rural Pennsylvania. What made Brownfield dangerous wasn't deception about his credentials. Everything about his background was legitimate. It was his theory of treatment that would devastate 8 families. His medical philosophy, outlined in the October 1890 Gazette interview, centered on what he called the root cause of female hysteria. Women's nervous disorders, Brownfield explained, stemmed from constitutional repression of natural feminine functions. Traditional treatments failed because they addressed symptoms while ignoring fundamental physiology. His approach, he claimed, treated the underlying condition through direct therapeutic intervention. The language he used was deliberately clinical. He spoke of manual stimulation techniques, intimate examination protocols, physical therapy addressing feminine reproductive health. To medically unsophisticated families in rural Pennsylvania, this sounded like cutting-edge science. Brownfield cited European physicians who supposedly pioneered these methods. He referenced ancient medical texts describing similar treatments. He made violation sound like medical progress. Within 2 months of opening Willowbrook, 8 prominent families had enrolled their daughters. The Kimballs, Rutherfords, Danvers, and 5 other wealthy households believed they were providing their children with the finest psychiatric care available. Brownfield met personally with each family, explaining his treatment philosophy in terms that sounded both sophisticated and necessary. What sealed their trust was his presentation of intimacy as medicine. Brownfield described how hysteria resulted from blocked feminine energy, how certain physical manipulations could restore proper function, how intimate contact administered by a trained physician served therapeutic purpose. He used anatomical terminology, discussed case studies, presented his approach as established medical practice rather than experimental theory. The families believed him because he made it sound scientifically inevitable. His journals from 1891 revealed how he implemented these treatments. After establishing trust during initial months of conventional care, Brownfield introduced what he called advanced therapeutic protocols. He began with clinical explanations, telling young women that their treatment now required physical interventions addressing their feminine constitution. When they expressed confusion or distress, he insisted this was standard medical procedure for their condition. The progression he documented was methodical. Initial treatments he described as therapeutic massage and manual examination. Then more invasive procedures he claimed addressed reproductive function. Eventually, complete intimate contact that he justified as necessary for full restoration of feminine equilibrium. Each stage was presented to patients as essential medicine, each violation cloaked in clinical terminology. What made this systematic abuse particularly horrifying was the family response. Brownfield's journals included letters from grateful parents praising treatments they didn't understand. The Kimball family wrote thanking him for their daughter's improved temperament after months of his intimate therapy. The Rutherfords expressed profound appreciation for his dedication to comprehensive treatment. The Danvers family credited his physical interventions with saving their daughter from permanent institutionalization. These letters arrived even as Brownfield documented in his journals the distress his treatments caused. He wrote about patients crying during sessions, about their attempts to refuse treatment, about their questions regarding why this was necessary. He also noted how he managed their resistance, explaining that discomfort was temporary, while therapeutic benefits were permanent. He told them their parents had consented to whatever treatment he deemed medically appropriate. During family visits, parents saw what they interpreted as improvement. Their daughters seemed quieter, more compliant, less emotionally volatile. Brownfield encouraged this interpretation, explaining that successful treatment often produced initial subdued behavior before full recovery emerged. What parents mistook for therapeutic progress was actually the psychological impact of ongoing violation. By 1892, 3 patients had become pregnant. Brownfield's journals revealed his response to these pregnancies as validation of his treatment success. He explained to families that their daughter's restored reproductive function proved his intimate therapy had worked exactly as intended. The parents, lacking any framework to understand what had actually occurred, accepted this explanation. They thanked him for curing conditions they believed had threatened their daughter's ability to bear children. The Kimball family donated $5,000 for a new treatment wing after their daughter's pregnancy. The Rutherfords sent a testimonial to the Pennsylvania Medical Journal praising Brownfield's innovative approach. Other families recommended Willowbrook to relatives facing similar concerns. The more effective Brownfield's abuse became at producing pregnancies, the more grateful the families grew. His journals from this period showed a man convinced of his own medical genius. He documented each pregnancy as a case study, each grateful family letter as evidence of therapeutic success. He never used language suggesting wrongdoing. Every entry described legitimate medical treatment producing intended results. In Brownfield's mind, he wasn't committing systematic abuse. He was advancing psychiatric science, while desperate families paid him to continue. Brownfield's published medical paper appeared in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease in March of 1893. The article, titled "Physical Interventions in Female Hysteria, a Revolutionary Approach," outlined his treatment methodology with enough clinical detachment to pass academic review. What made the publication significant wasn't just professional validation. It gave him a documented defense for everything he was doing. The paper described female hysteria as a condition requiring what he termed comprehensive corporeal therapy. Brownfield argued that traditional talk-based treatments and rest cures failed because they ignored the physical origins of nervous disorders. His approach, he claimed, addressed the actual source through direct manipulation of what he called feminine energetic pathways. The language was pseudoscientific enough to sound legitimate, while remaining vague enough to encompass virtually any physical contact he chose to impose. He presented case studies without naming patients. Patient A, treated for severe melancholia through intensive physical therapy, showed remarkable improvement after 6 months. Patient B, exhibiting hysteria and emotional volatility, achieved complete stabilization through sustained intimate intervention protocols. Patient C, previously considered untreatable, responded positively to what Brownfield described as full-spectrum corporeal adjustment techniques. The medical community's response was mixed, but not hostile. Some physicians dismissed his theories as unproven. Others expressed cautious interest in his reported results. None suggested his methods might constitute anything other than experimental medicine. The very publication of his approach in a respected journal gave Brownfield institutional legitimacy. When families questioned specific treatments, he could point to published research, to peer review, to academic validation of his methodology. His journals revealed how he used this publication. When Sarah Kimball expressed discomfort with certain procedures, Brownfield showed her the medical journal explaining that his techniques were recognized by physicians nationwide. When Elizabeth Rutherford attempted to describe treatments to her parents, he provided them with the published paper, assuring them that everything described therein represented standard therapeutic protocol for her condition. The families read academic language about manual stimulation therapy and intimate corporeal adjustment without fully comprehending what those terms meant in practice. Brownfield had constructed a vocabulary that sounded medical while describing violation. Parents saw their daughter's physician published in prestigious journals and felt reassured about treatment quality. They had no basis for understanding that publication didn't equal ethical practice. By 1894, Brownfield had refined his approach into a systematic protocol. New patients underwent weeks of conventional treatment, establishing baseline trust. Then he introduced what he called preparatory physical therapy, relatively minor intimate examinations presented as routine medical practice. Gradually, he escalated to procedures he termed advanced manipulation techniques. Finally, complete intimate contact that he justified as necessary for full therapeutic effect. Each stage was documented in treatment logs he shared with families during quarterly reviews. The logs used clinical terminology describing therapeutic interventions, physical responses, and progressive improvement markers. Parents reading these reports saw what appeared to be careful medical monitoring. They didn't recognize descriptions of systematic abuse because Brownfield had encoded violation in language that mimicked legitimate healthcare documentation. The gratitude letters continued accumulating. The Rutherford family wrote praising his patience with their daughter's difficult case. The Danvers family thanked him for treatments that had restored their daughter's feminine capacity, evidenced by her pregnancy. The Kimball family expressed appreciation for his willingness to employ unconventional methods when traditional approaches had failed. Each letter validated Brownfield's conviction that he was providing necessary medical care. His journals from this period showed increasing confidence in his methodology. He documented specific techniques, duration of therapeutic sessions, frequency of interventions required for different conditions. He noted which approaches produced the quickest compliance, which produced the most dramatic physical responses, which resulted in pregnancies most efficiently. He was systematizing abuse as if perfecting a medical procedure. What made his system particularly effective was the isolation he maintained. Willowbrook operated under his absolute authority. He controlled patient communication, supervised all visits, determined which information families received. Young women who tried expressing concerns found themselves labeled as experiencing treatment resistance, a symptom requiring increased therapeutic intervention. Their attempts to communicate truth were reinterpreted as proof they needed more of what they were trying to escape. The County Medical Board, which included Brownfield himself, conducted its annual Willowbrook inspection in May of 1894. The report praised the facility's organization, noted the impressive credentials of its medical director, and commended the grateful testimonials from patient families. The board found no cause for concern. Brownfield had constructed a system where he investigated himself. Families thanked him for abuse, and professional validation protected him from scrutiny. By year's end, 6 of the 12 pregnancies had occurred. Each one was celebrated by families as evidence their daughters were cured, capable of fulfilling proper feminine roles. Brownfield documented each pregnancy in his journals as a successful case study, proof his intimate therapy achieved its stated medical objectives. The horror wasn't just what he was doing. It was how completely he'd convinced everyone it was medicine. The donations began escalating in 1895. The Kimball family contributed funds for what they called the Therapeutic Innovation Wing, a new section of Willowbrook designed specifically for Brownfield's intimate treatment protocols. Their letter accompanying the donation expressed profound gratitude for methods that had transformed their daughter from melancholic and resistant to calm and expectant. The pregnancy they celebrated as cure had resulted directly from what they were now financing, expanded facilities to continue. Thomas Rutherford wrote to the county newspaper, praising Brownfield's courage in employing treatments that conventional physicians were too timid to attempt. His daughter's restoration to proper feminine function, evidenced by her condition, proved that modern medicine required bold practitioners willing to use physical interventions where talk therapy failed. The letter recommended other families consider Willowbrook for daughters exhibiting similar nervous disorders. Brownfield's journals from this period revealed his interpretation of such praise. He saw family gratitude as validation of his medical theories. Each thank you letter, each recommendation reinforced his conviction that intimate contact served legitimate therapeutic purpose. He documented how parental appreciation encouraged him to refine his techniques, to extend treatment durations, to employ what he termed more comprehensive physical protocols with remaining patients. The treatment logs he maintained showed systematic progression. He recorded which specific intimate practices produced the quickest compliance in patients, which generated the most pronounced physical responses, which most efficiently resulted in the pregnancies he considered evidence of successful cure. These weren't the observations of someone who recognized wrongdoing. They were the clinical notes of a physician convinced he was advancing medical science. His approach to family consultations became more explicit during this period. When parents visited Willowbrook for quarterly reviews, Brownfield began describing his intimate therapy methods in greater detail. He explained that treating feminine hysteria required direct physical engagement with reproductive systems. He used anatomical terminology, referenced his published research, assured families that such interventions represented accepted medical practice for severe cases. The families accepted these explanations because Brownfield had established unassailable credibility. He was published, respected, and produced results other physicians couldn't achieve. When he explained that his treatments involved sustained, intimate contact, parents heard medical procedure rather than violation. When he described techniques requiring complete physical access to patients, they understood therapeutic necessity rather than abuse. Margaret Danvers became pregnant in April of 1895. Her parents responded with a letter thanking Brownfield for restoring what they called her natural feminine capacity. They had feared their daughter's hysteria had permanently damaged her ability to fulfill a woman's proper role. The pregnancy proved otherwise. They credited Brownfield's intimate therapy with correcting what they believed was a medical dysfunction. They recommended his methods to 3 other families, whose daughters subsequently enrolled at Willowbrook. Brownfield documented this case extensively in his journals. He described the specific treatment protocols he'd employed with Margaret, the frequency and duration of intimate sessions, the progression from initial resistance to eventual pregnancy. He wrote about explaining to her parents exactly what his therapy involved, about their grateful acceptance of methods that had produced such desirable results. He saw no contradiction between their gratitude and their daughter's suffering. By 1896, 8 pregnancies had occurred across the 8 families. Each resulted in celebrations from parents who believed their daughters were cured. The Rutherfords hosted a dinner honoring Brownfield's contributions to psychiatric medicine. The Kimballs proposed naming the new treatment wing after him. Families wrote testimonials for medical journals describing miraculous recoveries under his care. What none of these families understood was that their daughters' pregnancies weren't evidence of restored function. They were evidence of systematic, intimate abuse disguised as medical treatment. The young women knew the truth. They tried expressing it during visits, attempted describing what therapeutic sessions actually involved, sought ways to communicate that Brownfield's treatments weren't medicine, but violation. Brownfield's journals documented these attempts. He wrote about patients becoming emotional during family consultations, about their efforts to explain treatments in non-clinical terms, about their distress when describing therapeutic protocols. He also documented how he managed such situations. He explained to families that emotional responses indicated treatment was working, that distress reflected the difficulty of confronting root causes of hysteria, that attempts to characterize legitimate medical procedures as inappropriate demonstrated ongoing mental disorder requiring continued intervention. The families believed him. They trusted his medical expertise over their daughters' emotional appeals. When young women tried describing the reality of intimate therapy, parents heard hysteria speaking rather than truth. Brownfield had constructed a system where victim testimony was reinterpreted as symptom, where attempts to expose abuse became evidence justifying more abuse. The county medical community remained entirely supportive. Brownfield presented a paper at the Pennsylvania Medical Society's annual conference in November 1896. He described his intimate treatment protocols, discussed the resulting pregnancies as therapeutic outcomes, received polite interest from attending physicians. Nobody questioned whether his methods might constitute something other than experimental medicine. His credentials, publications, and grateful patient families insulated him from scrutiny that might have revealed what was actually occurring at Willowbrook. The pattern Brownfield had established became fully visible when researchers cross-referenced his journals with birth records from neighboring counties. Between 1891 and 1902, 12 young women from the 8 families gave birth during or immediately after their stays at Willowbrook. What made these births particularly revealing was the consistent explanation Brownfield provided for each pregnancy, and the uniform gratitude families expressed in response. Hospital admission records showed careful geographic dispersal. Brownfield arranged for patients to deliver in facilities across 3 counties, never using the same hospital twice consecutively. The discharge papers he filed listed varying explanations. Some documented miraculous recoveries following childbirth. Others described treatments reaching natural completion. Several noted family reclamation after successful therapeutic intervention. The language changed, but the underlying pattern remained consistent. Birth certificates told their own story. Every child was listed as born to an unwed mother. Every certificate noted father unknown. But Brownfield's private journals, discovered in that hidden wall compartment, contained details that painted an entirely different picture. He documented which specific intimate therapy sessions corresponded with which pregnancies. He recorded the progression from treatment initiation to conception with clinical precision. He tracked these outcomes as data points proving his methodology's effectiveness. What emerged from the Historical Society's analysis was Brownfield's systematic approach to managing these pregnancies. When patients showed signs of conception, he immediately contacted their families with news he presented as therapeutic breakthrough. Letters preserved in family archives revealed his exact language. He wrote that intimate treatment protocols had successfully restored feminine reproductive capacity. He explained that pregnancy proved the therapy had corrected underlying hysteria by re-establishing proper physical function. The families responded with overwhelming gratitude. The Historical Society found 17 separate thank you letters written after pregnancy announcements. Parents expressed relief that their daughters weren't permanently damaged by nervous disorders. They praised Brownfield's willingness to employ unconventional methods that conventional physicians wouldn't consider. They credited his intimate therapy with achieving what they believed was medical restoration of their daughter's natural abilities. Sarah Kimball's pregnancy in 1897 generated a particularly effusive response from her parents. Their letter, preserved in Brownfield's papers, thanked him for treatments that had taken their daughter from hysteria-induced dysfunction to capable motherhood. They noted that previous physicians had suggested Sarah might never overcome her nervous condition. Brownfield's intimate interventions had proven those assessments wrong. They enclosed a donation for continued research into his therapeutic methods. Brownfield documented his response to such letters in his journals. He wrote about feeling validated in his approach, about recognizing that families understood the necessity of his intimate treatments, about conviction that parental gratitude justified the comprehensive physical protocols he employed. He saw himself as a pioneer whose courage in using intimate contact as medicine was finally receiving proper recognition. The adoption arrangements he made revealed another layer of systematic planning. Brownfield maintained relationships with families in distant Pennsylvania counties who wanted children. When patients at Willowbrook gave birth, he personally facilitated adoptions through private arrangements that bypassed official agencies. Court records showed he received what were termed gratitude donations from adoptive families, payments that substantially increased his wealth during this period. His journals described these adoptions as final evidence of therapeutic success. The young mothers, he wrote, were cured of hysteria and able to return to normal life. The children were placed in stable homes. The adoptive families were grateful for opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have. Everyone benefited from his intimate treatment protocols, producing these outcomes. He saw the entire system as proof. His methods served multiple beneficial purposes. Property records from 1898 through 1900 showed Brownfield acquiring significant real estate in Clearfield County, a second home in town, commercial properties generating rental income, farmland outside the county seat. The financial records cross-referenced with his journals revealed that adoption arrangements contributed substantially to this wealth accumulation. Families paid him for therapy that caused pregnancies. Then other families paid him for children resulting from that abuse. Elizabeth Rutherford gave birth in 1900, the 10th pregnancy in Brownfield's systematic pattern. Her parents sent a letter thanking him for intimate treatments that had transformed their daughter from rebellious and unfeminine to capable of proper motherhood. They recommended Willowbrook to the Pritchard family, whose daughter was exhibiting similar nervous symptoms. Within 2 months, the Pritchards enrolled their daughter for treatment under Brownfield's intimate therapy protocols. The medical board's 1899 inspection report, signed by Brownfield himself among other board members, commended Willowbrook's continued excellence. The report noted grateful testimonials from patient families, successful therapeutic outcomes, including multiple restored reproductive functions, and innovative treatment methods that brought recognition to Clearfield County's medical community. The board recommended continued support for Brownfield's research into physical interventions for female hysteria. By 1900, Brownfield had created a self-sustaining system. Families paid him to abuse their daughters under the guise of intimate therapy. When pregnancies resulted, families thanked him for curing supposed dysfunction. He arranged adoptions that generated additional income. Grateful families recommended others, ensuring a steady supply of new patients. And throughout it all, he documented everything in journals that read like medical research rather than evidence of systematic violation. What made Brownfield's system nearly impervious to challenge was the institutional power he'd accumulated by 1900. Beyond serving on the county medical board that inspected his own facility, he'd been elected president of the Clearfield County Medical Society. He reviewed credentials for physicians seeking to practice in the region. He sat on hospital advisory committees. He determined standards for psychiatric care across 3 counties. The man whose intimate therapy protocols constituted systematic abuse was also the authority who defined acceptable medical practice. Legal documents from 1901 revealed how this power protected him when families finally began questioning his methods. The Hargrove family attempted to withdraw their daughter from Willowbrook after she became visibly distressed during a visit home. She'd tried explaining what therapeutic sessions actually involved, describing intimate contact that sounded nothing like medicine to her mother. The Hargroves consulted an attorney about removing her from Brownfield's care. Brownfield's response, preserved in court filings, demonstrated how thoroughly he'd insulated himself. His attorney argued that the daughter's accusations were themselves symptoms of untreated hysteria. Her attempts to characterize legitimate medical procedures as inappropriate proved she required continued institutionalization under expert care. Brownfield submitted his published research, letters from grateful families, and testimony from county medical board members supporting his treatment protocols. The judge ruled that the daughter must remain at Willowbrook until Brownfield certified her cure was complete. His journals documented this case with satisfaction. He wrote that legal validation of his authority to continue treatment despite family objections proved the system recognized his methods as necessary medicine. He noted that the Hargrove daughter's pregnancy 4 months later demonstrated the wisdom of the court's decision. Her restored reproductive capacity, he wrote, vindicated both his intimate therapy and the legal system that protected his right to administer it. The second challenge came from the Preston family in 1902. Their daughter had written letters describing treatment sessions in explicit detail, language that made clear these weren't medical examinations, but sustained intimate contact serving no therapeutic purpose. The Prestons brought these letters to a physician in a neighboring county, seeking a second opinion on whether such practices constituted appropriate psychiatric care. That physician's report, located in Historical Society archives, showed how Brownfield's professional standing defeated scrutiny. The doctor acknowledged the described treatment sounded unusual, but noted Brownfield's impeccable credentials and published research. He observed that multiple families reported successful outcomes from these methods. He concluded that while the intimate protocols might make patients uncomfortable, discomfort didn't equal inappropriate care. Revolutionary treatments often seemed disturbing to those unfamiliar with cutting-edge medical science. Brownfield learned of this inquiry and immediately contacted the Preston family. His letter, preserved in court records, expressed disappointment that they'd sought outside opinions rather than trusting his expertise. He explained that their daughter's letters demonstrated ongoing hysteria requiring intensified treatment. He noted that their lack of confidence in his methods could undermine therapeutic progress. He suggested that if they truly wanted their daughter cured, they needed to trust his intimate interventions to reach their natural conclusion. The Prestons withdrew their complaint. Their daughter remained at Willowbrook for 7 more months, during which she became pregnant. Brownfield's journals recorded their letter of apology and gratitude after learning of the pregnancy. They thanked him for persisting with treatment despite their momentary doubt. They praised his dedication to seeing intimate therapy through to successful outcome. They sent a donation covering costs of their daughter's care through delivery. What these attempted interventions revealed was how completely Brownfield had normalized his practices. County clergy who heard concerning confessions from patients were told that medical matters required medical expertise. Nurses who expressed discomfort with treatment protocols were dismissed for questioning a physician's judgment. Family members who felt uneasy about intimate therapy were assured that revolutionary methods generated initial resistance. One nurse's testimony, given decades later to historical researchers, described her single day working at Willowbrook in 1902. She'd been hired to assist with what Brownfield called therapeutic sessions. When she realized these sessions consisted of sustained, intimate contact between physician and patient, she objected. Brownfield explained that her lack of medical training prevented her from understanding the therapeutic necessity of his physical interventions. He dismissed her that afternoon. When she reported what she'd witnessed to the county medical board, Brownfield himself reviewed her complaint and determined it lacked merit. His journals from this period showed increasing conviction in his methods. He documented how legal validation, professional support, and continued family gratitude proved his intimate therapy served legitimate medical purpose. He wrote about plans to publish a comprehensive textbook describing his techniques in detail, a manual that would allow other physicians to replicate his success in treating female hysteria through physical intimacy. By 1903, 11 of the 12 pregnancies had occurred. Each had been celebrated by families as evidence of cure. Each had generated grateful letters praising Brownfield's courage in employing treatments that conventional physicians avoided. Each had resulted in adoptions arranged by Brownfield that added to his growing wealth. And each had further validated his conviction that intimate contact with patients constituted breakthrough psychiatric medicine, deserving professional recognition and institutional protection. The voices of the young women themselves remained largely absent from official records, suppressed by a system that reinterpreted their testimony as symptoms requiring treatment. But fragments survived, in unexpected places. A cache of confiscated letters discovered in Brownfield's personal files during the 1978 investigation revealed desperate attempts to communicate truth that families never received. Catherine Whitfield wrote to her parents in October of 1900, describing treatment sessions in language carefully chosen to convey reality without explicitly violating the therapeutic confidentiality Brownfield had insisted they maintain. She wrote about feeling confused by medical procedures that seemed to have nothing to do with her melancholia. She described crying during treatments and being told her tears proved the therapy was working. She asked why restoration of mental equilibrium required such sustained physical contact. The letter never left Willowbrook. Brownfield's notation on the envelope read, "Patient exhibiting treatment resistance. Communication suspended, pending therapeutic compliance." Another letter, written by Anne Lowell to her sister in 1898, attempted describing intimate therapy in terms that might prompt outside intervention. She wrote that Dr. Brownfield's methods felt wrong, despite his insistence they were necessary medicine. She explained that treatments occurred in locked rooms with no nurses present. She noted that therapeutic sessions left her feeling violated rather than cured. Brownfield intercepted this letter as well. His journal entry from that date documented increased treatment frequency for Anne, noting that her attempts to characterize proper medical care as inappropriate demonstrated deepening hysteria, requiring more intensive intimate intervention. The most detailed account came from a diary kept by Margaret Danvers before her pregnancy in 1895. The diary, hidden in her room, and discovered years later during facility renovations, contained entries describing her progression from confused patient to someone who understood exactly what was happening, but had no power to stop it. Early entries questioned why treatment required such intimate contact. Later entries documented her attempts to refuse sessions, and Brownfield's explanations that her parents had authorized whatever therapy he deemed necessary. The final entries, written in increasingly desperate handwriting, described her realization that she was pregnant and her terror about how this would be interpreted as cure rather than consequence. What made these suppressed communications particularly damning was how Brownfield systematically prevented them from reaching anyone who might have intervened. His journals documented a comprehensive system for controlling patient correspondence. All letters were reviewed before mailing. Any communication that characterized intimate therapy as anything other than medical treatment was confiscated. Patients who persisted in attempting to describe treatments truthfully faced what Brownfield termed therapeutic isolation, extended periods with no family contact to prevent what he called contamination of the treatment environment with outside skepticism. When families visited, Brownfield supervised all interactions. His journals described how he positioned himself during visits to monitor conversations, how he redirected discussions when patients attempted describing treatments in non-clinical terms, how he explained to parents that any distress their daughters exhibited indicated therapy was successfully confronting root causes of hysteria. He'd created a system where the only voices families heard were his own and those of patients who'd learned that honest communication accomplished nothing. The Preston family's daughter managed to smuggle a letter out through a visiting cousin in 1902. The letter, preserved in family archives, stated plainly that Dr. Brownfield's intimate treatments were not medicine. She described sustained physical contact that served no therapeutic purpose. She wrote that she'd become pregnant as direct result of what he called therapy. She begged her family to remove her from Willowbrook before treatments continued. The family confronted Brownfield with this letter. His response, documented in his journals, demonstrated how effectively he'd constructed psychological defenses for his system. He explained that the letter proved their daughter's hysteria remained untreated. Her pregnancy, he insisted, was evidence his intimate therapy was working. Her characterization of successful treatment as violation showed she needed continued intervention to accept her restored feminine capacity. He convinced the Prestons that their daughter's own testimony was unreliable, that his medical judgment superseded her emotional claims, that removing her from his care would undo therapeutic progress. They believed him. The letter that should have ended Brownfield's practice instead generated a grateful note from the Prestons 3 months later, thanking him for helping them understand that their daughter's distress was part of the healing process. They praised his patience in educating them about how revolutionary treatments often generated resistance before producing cure. They apologized for doubting methods that had ultimately restored their daughter's ability to fulfill proper feminine roles. By 1903, Brownfield had successfully silenced or reinterpreted every voice that attempted exposing his intimate therapy as systematic abuse. Patient letters were confiscated. Diary entries remained hidden. Family confrontations were managed through explanations that positioned abuse as medicine and testimony as symptom. The system he'd built protected itself through a simple mechanism that he'd convinced everyone, including victims' own families, that the women's words couldn't be trusted, while his words deserved absolute faith. The final 4 pregnancies occurred between 1901 and 1903, completing Brownfield's pattern of 12 victims across 8 families. What distinguished these last cases was how refined his system had become. He no longer needed to convince families that intimate therapy served medical purpose. The earlier pregnancies had done that work for him. Now families specifically requested his most comprehensive treatment protocols, the very methods that constituted systematic abuse. The Caldwell family enrolled their daughter in 1901 after hearing testimonials from the Rutherfords about Brownfield's success in restoring feminine capacity through physical interventions. Their initial consultation letter, preserved in county archives, explicitly requested that he employ whatever intimate treatments he deemed necessary. They'd heard these methods produced the most dramatic cures. They wanted their daughter to receive Brownfield's complete therapeutic approach, including the physical protocols that had helped so many others. Brownfield's journals documented his response to such requests with evident satisfaction. He wrote that families now understood intimate contact wasn't unfortunate necessity, but essential medicine. Parents were specifically seeking treatments they once would have questioned. The evolution in family attitudes proved his methods had gained acceptance as legitimate psychiatric care. He no longer needed to justify his practices. Grateful testimonials from previous families had done that for him. The 12th and final pregnancy occurred in September of 1903. Medical records showed the patient was Rachel Pemberton, whose family had enrolled her after 3 other physicians failed to cure her nervous condition. The Pembertons had researched Brownfield's published papers, consulted with families whose daughters he'd treated, and concluded that his intimate therapy offered their best hope. Their daughter became pregnant within 5 months of admission. The Pembertons responded with a letter praising Brownfield's comprehensive approach. They thanked him for treatments that conventional physicians lacked courage to attempt. They credited his intimate interventions with achieving what they called miraculous restoration of their daughter's natural abilities. They recommended Willowbrook to 4 other families, though by then, Brownfield had already decided to close the facility. Asylum ledgers revealed that Brownfield personally arranged all 12 adoptions, maintaining detailed records of which families received which children. He documented gratitude payments from adoptive parents, financial arrangements that substantially enriched him. Property records showed his final real estate acquisition in October 1903, a substantial town residence purchased with proceeds from adoption fees and family donations for treatments that had produced those pregnancies. His journals from this period showed a man convinced of his own righteousness. He'd spent 12 years employing intimate contact as psychiatric treatment. 12 pregnancies had resulted, each celebrated by families as cure. Grateful letters filled his files. Professional colleagues respected his published research. The medical board he served on had never questioned his methods. In Brownfield's mind, the systematic abuse he'd perpetrated wasn't violation, but validated medical innovation that desperate families had paid him to provide. In November of 1903, Brownfield announced Willowbrook's closure with no explanation beyond professional advancement opportunities in Philadelphia. The Clearfield County Gazette published a laudatory article celebrating his contributions to local medicine. Prominent families hosted a farewell dinner where speakers praised his innovative treatments and compassionate care. The county medical board presented him with a commendation for distinguished service. Nobody questioned why a successful facility with grateful clientele was suddenly closing. His journals revealed the calculation behind this decision. 12 pregnancies across 12 years had established his reputation and generated substantial wealth. But Brownfield recognized that continuing the pattern risked eventual scrutiny. Better to close at the height of success, preserve his standing, and relocate where his published research would open new opportunities. He sold the Willowbrook property to the county for institutional use, negotiating terms that ensured his personal records would transfer with him to Philadelphia. The sale documents showed Brownfield received substantial payment beyond the property's assessed value. County commissioners, grateful for his years of service, approved what they termed a professional appreciation bonus. The families whose daughters he'd treated contributed additional funds as farewell gifts, thanking him one final time for intimate therapies that had produced what they still celebrated as miraculous cures. What Brownfield left behind was a carefully constructed legacy. Newspaper archives contained only praise. Medical society records documented his innovations without criticism. Family correspondence expressed gratitude without understanding what they were actually thanking him for. The 12 young women who'd become pregnant under his care were scattered across Pennsylvania, their children adopted through his private arrangements, the truth of what had happened at Willowbrook buried beneath layers of clinical language and institutional validation. Census records from 1904 showed the 12 mothers living separate lives. Some had married, their histories carefully concealed. Others remained in family homes, their experiences never discussed. Several had been institutionalized elsewhere for ongoing nervous conditions, their trauma reinterpreted as chronic illness. None had public voice to contradict the narrative Brownfield had established, that intimate therapy had cured rather than caused their suffering. Brownfield arrived in Philadelphia with impeccable credentials, published research, and letters of recommendation from grateful families. He joined the staff at a prestigious psychiatric hospital, bringing his theories about physical interventions for female hysteria to a new population of vulnerable patients. His journals, packed carefully for the move, contained detailed documentation of 12 years employing intimate contact as systematic abuse, while convincing everyone it was medicine. The horror wasn't just what he'd done at Willowbrook. It was that he'd proven the system would protect him while doing it again elsewhere. Dr. Jones Brownfield died in February of 1927 at age 68. The Philadelphia Medical Journal published a 2-page obituary celebrating his contributions to psychiatric medicine. Colleagues remembered him as a pioneering researcher who'd courageously explored physical treatments for female nervous disorders. His funeral drew prominent physicians from across Pennsylvania. Nobody eulogizing him mentioned Willowbrook or questioned the methods that had built his reputation. The truth remained hidden for 51 years. When Thomas Garrett's crowbar broke through that false wall in 1978, the journals he discovered forced a reckoning that Brownfield had successfully evaded during his lifetime. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office opened a historical investigation that ultimately documented systematic abuse disguised as medical treatment across 12 years. Genealogical researchers eventually located descendants of 5 victims. The investigation revealed family histories marked by institutionalization, silenced trauma, and secrets maintained across generations. One woman, granddaughter of a Willowbrook patient, described discovering her grandmother's diary in an attic trunk. The entries described treatments that sounded nothing like medicine, gratitude letters her great-grandparents had written thanking Brownfield, and the profound isolation of knowing truth that nobody would believe. What the investigation couldn't recover were the voices of the 12 young women themselves. Most had died before the journals were discovered. The few surviving family members who knew fragments of what had occurred at Willowbrook had spent decades being told their relatives' accounts were unreliable, symptoms of persistent hysteria rather than testimony about systematic violation. The institutional machinery that had protected Brownfield continued silencing his victims, even after his death. The Willowbrook site became a municipal park in 1982. Proposals to install a memorial marker acknowledging what had occurred there generated intense opposition from descendants of the 8 families. They argued that public acknowledgement would dishonor relatives who'd believed they were providing their daughters with medical care. The compromise was a small plaque noting the location's psychiatric history without specific details about Brownfield's practices. Historians who studied the case identified it as an example of how institutional authority, professional credentials, and family desperation could enable systematic abuse while generating gratitude from those being victimized. Brownfield had convinced families that intimate contact with their daughters served therapeutic purpose. The resulting pregnancies were celebrated as cures, and 12 young women spent their lives carrying the weight of violations that everyone around them insisted were medicine. The truth emerged only because Brownfield documented everything, convinced his journals would someday be studied as groundbreaking medical research rather than evidence of systematic abuse disguised as psychiatric care. If this story disturbed you, imagine how many similar patterns remain undiscovered, hidden behind professional credentials and institutional authority. Hit that like button if you believe these histories need to be told. Subscribe so you never miss investigations into the darkness that systems of power can hide. The past only stops repeating when we refuse to look away.